parts, you've got the yolk, you've got the albumin, which is the white of the egg, the shell membrane, or the egg shell. That's kind of the main focus of what I'm going to be talking about today. You'll also sometimes have an embryo in the egg if things are really good and exciting, but we won't talk about that until a little bit later. Eggs are really important as far as the terrestrial invasion by vertebrates. The eggshell allowed vertebrates to colonize land and basically allow the egg to be a little portable womb for the animals to develop and kind of restrict the amount of water loss happening. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the microstructure of the eggshell itself, what allows it to facilitate that gas exchange and respiration and that sense of protection that it offers to developing it. So the eggshells typically have 3 layers. By typically, I mean it depends on who you ask and how much detail you want to go into on those layers. At the most basic level, the most internal layer is just the boundary layer between the internal fluids of the egg and the rest of the eggshell. The membrana testicea, however you want to pronounce that, basically a matrix of soft tissues. And then on the external layer, the calcareous layer. Most often it's made of calcium or calcite. Occasionally you've got some other minerals in there, but predominantly it's made of calcium. And depending on the relative ratio of how much calcium you have in the shell and how that's distributed within the eggshell, you'll have either hard eggs, hard-shelled eggs like bird eggs. A handful of geckos will have that as well. Crocodiles and many herbivores will be having hard shells also. With progressively less amounts of calcium or other configurations of the calcium layer, and you'll end up having either soft or semi-rigid eggs. Also a relatively fluid distinction of how hard is hard. Another aspect of the microstructure of eggshells are the pore structures that transect the shell. They will be of different morphologies themselves and of different distributions depending on the family or the group. Depending on how many pores you have, that will increase or decrease the amount of water vapor transpiration that is taking place across the shell membrane. The actual structure of the pores will also vary. Some of them will start to bifurcate or furcate further. Others will just be narrow, some are wider than others. This also varies greatly amongst different taxa, and the current expectation for what predicts this is just the environment in which the egg is. More arid environments will typically have shells with fewer pores to try and reduce the amount of water loss experienced by the egg. But this also is not 100%, and there's a lot of different factors going into what's happening there, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The next major aspect of morphology of eggs I want to talk about is the overall shape of the egg. For most reptilian, non-avian reptilian eggs, their main shape axes are just going to be whether or not it's the size or whether or not it's the shape of a soft golf ball or whether or not it's a little bit more long. Those are going to be your main axes. We've got a third axis for fun here because that's all you have for non-avian reptiles, so relative calcium content. It's also, again, more or less a proxy for how hard or how solid the eggshell is. If you want to also include non-avian or avian reptiles, which I do want to include in this talk about reptilian eggs, then you've got an extra axis of asymmetry when we're describing the overall shape of the egg. You'll also notice that we have other features such as color and maculation. On the far right, in very small looking phylogeny is the entirety of all of bird families. You don't need to see anything as far as detail, just notice that the lines that are dark represent eggs. Families that have eggs are either colored or speckled or have some sort of visual thing going on, while the rest of the white bars are standing for immaculate white eggs. So we've got this extra element of diversity coming in. We've got asymmetry, we've got color, but I'm not going to be focusing too much on color right now. There are a lot of very smart people working on that. One of them could have been me, but I decided not to do that for a couple of drama reasons that I shall not go into. But I also wanted to talk about a little bit about what causes or what kind of influences these different elements of morphological diversity that we find in eggs. So a lot of the porosity that I spoke about earlier, people are kind of meeting on that being related to the nest environment, the relative humidity. Some other factors also involve whether or not there's parental care or what kind of nest defense is there. Everything that's related due to just the relative hardness of shells, whether or not they're defending against predators. Or also as some of the nests, depending on how they're thermoregulated, there may or may not be parental influence on that. Also the number of eggs in a clutch and the way those eggs are arranged, they also have an influence over the structure of the egg. ability to have the structural integrity to resist being squashed by either dirt or someone stepping on them or the parents actually sitting on top of the egg itself. There are cases of sometimes something goes wrong, the parent either steps on an egg, as in the case of some birds, or of course there's getting stepped on in the wild by just things walking by as well. So kind of nest choice and nest placement is also very important as far as an influence of egg morphology overall, whether or not they're hidden or if they're in view. Another interesting aspect of egg morphology that I wanted to kind of explore and talk about is the morphology of the actual parent, or the morphology of the organism altogether. For example, in testudines, almost all of their eggs are relatively round. It kind of makes sense when turtles themselves are also relatively round, but you do also have some turtles that are less round, and yet they are still hatching out of round eggs. So I find that rather interesting. Snakes, of course, almost every part of a snake is elongate. A lot of the times their eggs are also elongate, but that is not always true. But this is also something that's been considered in birds. On the bottom right, I've got a chart from a paper about the relative length and asymmetry of an bird egg being related to the overall body shape of the adult. And they found that there's a relationship between birds and their ability to fly and having longer or more asymmetrical eggs. That was actually thought to be to do with the shape of the pelvis of the adult, kind of constraining the shape of the egg that it would be able to lay. So all of those are relatively interesting examples that I find that I feel is a little bit underexplored as far as the role of the actual morphology of the individuals, of the organism involved in the egg, more so than environmental factors. So I want to talk a little bit about the questions that I'm interested in as far as research. So I kind of want to go to the fundamentals of this. How exactly does the morphology of the shell balance the important functions to resist hatch failure? So as far as how is it able to complete the amount of respiration that it needs to do to keep the embryo alive, also be firm enough that the embryo is able to be protected from external forces, but also be able to be fractured by the embryo itself, because at the end of the day, the embryo needs to get out of the egg. So the couple of things I want to focus on, I want to sort of break down this question into a couple of specific topics I want to focus on. So first one is thickness variation. I've got a picture of a bird egg up there. They're known to have different thicknesses at different regions of the shell. They are also, up to all reptilia eggs are known to thin throughout the course of incubation and development. So I'm kind of curious what that means as far as does it make it a little bit easier for the embryo to hatch, or does it otherwise compromise the egg in any way? The microstructure and mineralization. I've already mentioned there's a couple of different other minerals that may be involved in the shell. Calcium is of course the most common, but you also have aragonite, I believe, in testudines, and also some birds will have another mineral called baterite. And also the actual structure of how the calcium is deposited will vary. The overall egg shape is of interest to me. The different axes of variation are different amongst non-avian versus avian reptiles. Avians, of course, so you've got your asymmetry going on that you don't have in non-avian reptiles, but we do have going on in non-avian reptiles is that element of softness, that deformity that can happen in shells that aren't rigid. And the last thing I was looking at is the pore structure and distribution. Where the pores distribute on the egg may be significant. It is currently unknown amongst birds at least, but maybe some of the more hurt people will be able to have an answer to that, or perhaps know somebody who has an answer to that. But it has been confirmed that there is a selective pressure to have pores sufficiently distributed in the right places and to have the right number of pores altogether. So I'm going to segue into what I plan to do to actually get at these questions. I acknowledge that there is not really any mortality curves out there for eggs, at least not really for birds. So I've got my little D&D Adventures League of 1,000 Tiny Deaths up there because people aren't always sure when exactly during development an egg dies. It's often did it hatch or did it not, and then that's usually the end of the day. But I'm really curious about what's going wrong along the way. So in order to kind of get at that, I plan to use live embryonated eggs and collect my data from them as they develop to see what exactly is going on at each stage of development up until they hatch. And to do that, one of the main methods I'm wanting to use is micro-CT imaging. I'm going to be scanning as many eggs as I can get my hands on to get that variation, get that going for phenotypic comparison, so we're trying to get as many as I can. That will also give me a complete 360-degree view of where thinning is happening across the eggshell. People often take for granted the symmetry of bird eggs, and I'm curious whether or not that is not the right thing to do. And I'll also be doing some stress modeling. I'm wanting to use these models to do some FEA, finite element analysis on them to see where these stresses are actually happening, to see how much of an influence the actual curvature of the eggshell has on resisting fracture and impact. So these are things that are relatively more bird themed, I'm sure you've noticed. But some other things I wanted to look at, more to do with the physiology of eggshells, are the respiration, the ability of the eggshell to actually be permeable and allow water vapor out and oxygen in. Embryo movement is also something that I'm very interested in. Different taxa will have different amounts of movement as far as right before hatching, embryos may become more or less active. And this is very distinct in a couple of specific target species I'm looking at, such as cowbirds, which are known to be nest parasites. They'll parasitize other nests and lay their eggs in a foreign bird's nest. And the baby will hatch and then usually outcompete its nest mates. Those birds are also known to have embryos that are much more active before hatch as opposed to their hosts. So the influence of the embryo in its egg and how that relates to the actual conditions of the egg are really interesting to me as well. Hidden behavior is also of great intrigue. This is particularly interesting when it comes to just embryos of different body shape and different morphology. If you've got a very long neck, you're going to have a slightly different amount of leverage to get the eggshell open. Also thinking about the way that shows up in reptiles, non-avian reptiles. Snakes, of course, they've got relatively short necks, but they are just one long coil, and how they're bracing themselves against a non-rigid egg in order to rip open their egg is of interest. Turtles and testudines in general have a very different situation. They're very rigid themselves, being a creature in a shell. So the way that they brace themselves against their shell to exit is also very interesting to me. So the reason why I've been kind of focusing on birds altogether, part of it is convenience. Part of it is also that birds represent just like the flagship massive diversification boom in the reptilia clade altogether. So I find that very interesting, and if the egg and its morphology has anything to do with facilitating that boom in diversity, I would like to explore that a little bit more. The shell structure variation is a little bit different. You don't have as much of that deformity happening, so that kind of simplifies the mechanical properties of that. The rigidity also lends to that. Embryonic morphology variation is also much more simplified. Most baby birds pretty much all look the same. The color variation I mentioned earlier, that has not a whole lot to do with the mechanics at a macro scale, but at a micro scale, that maculation can have an effect on the actual rigidity of the shell and its resistance to radiation. Parental care is also much more prevalent in non-avian reptiles. It's kind of just the egg against the world. So there's a little bit more selective pressure on that egg to be able to survive without that additional element of protection that comes from the parent. I also want to talk about the vigility of the adults. So the interesting thing that I find is the major difference between birds and reptiles, or non-avian reptiles, is that birds have a much greater ability to disperse and travel long distances, so they're not as constrained by their nesting site to get themselves around the world, whereas reptiles tend to have a much harder time dispersing. So their relative nesting range is going to be very tightly tied to the overall range of the whole species. Cool. Then I will go relatively quicker. I will skip that one because I've already decided why I want to do birds. So in the future, I want to also incorporate the egg tooth morphology in what I want to in this region altogether, because the egg tooth is going to be expected to do a couple of different functions depending on the rigidity of the shell. It's either going to be trying to slice open something soft or puncture through something that will fracture. So those are two different mechanical events, and considering how the egg tooth has evolved to cope with each of these, I think it's really interesting. We're also seeing whether or not that's kind of the inverse, whether or not the shell is kind of built dependent on what the embryo is able to fracture. I also want to look at pre and post-hatch development, especially as how the shell can kind of constrain the morphology of birds specifically, as far as birds with very strange and bizarre bills. I've got a hummingbird up there because they have long bills. And it turns out it's because the bills generally grow hatching is highly contested by people who raise or rear animals that hatch. The interesting thing is that it does actually crop up naturally in nature sometimes. Some species assist hatch their young on purpose. So the relevance of that and how important that is to the overall evolution of morphology is